Hi, everybody. So let's kick it right off. To understand ACE, it's first good to have a foundation because ACE does reside inside the planning phase of things. And so let's take a quick overlook at the planning phase, and then Sylvia and Chris are going to walk you through the ACE process. So when we take a look, next slide, please. Here's a graphic that gives you a broad look at the four major planning project phases, if you will. And it's important to recognize that we are moving from systems level analysis and planning toward the individual project progression. So downline, of course, we have the PD&E design and construction phases that naturally progress our projects. And certainly here you can see some of their subcomponents. But it is the planning phase that transforms us from systems level planning, all the studies, all the needs identification that occurs there, and moves us into individual project solutions and then ultimately programming, right, before we get to PD&E. So the planning phase components are essential to help us establish a project need, some early ideas of conceptual solutions, programming information. It's also a great opportunity to collaborate with and align with our local governments and stakeholders and the public. So numerous activities are occurring during the planning phase, which you're seeing down below in those bars. You certainly have the ETDM process, that's the efficient transportation decision-making process, which does include alternative corridor evaluations residing within it. We also have, since 2006, FHWA, that's the Federal Highway Administration, has created an initiative called the Planning and Environmental Linkages, which I'll speak to in a little bit, but that establishes that vital connection, and it's a legal connection nowadays from planning phase into your PD&E phase. As well, in recent years, we've developed the SWOT process, which does two things really. It's really the project initiation phase nowadays, or process nowadays. It informs the project selection to the tentative work program and ultimately to the approved 5-year work program. And then it also, once projects are selected for that, it helps us to prepare for an efficient and smooth start of PD&E. So as you can imagine, all the while there are public involvement opportunities, interagency coordination occurring through the planning phase. But I think it's important to point out here, there are many, fortunately, less complex projects such as 3R, small jobs that are not going to have a PD&E phase, and they might even start in design. So these would not use the ACE process. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so transportation systems planning is where projects are born. As you can imagine, MPOs, counties, cities, everybody, Carnival Cruise Line, they all have their own ideas of what their needs are. And so they're approaching FDOT with various needs lists. And certainly early studies can help to identify some potential solutions. So just to throw out some examples of planning products that occur, of course, with FDOT, we are producing the Florida Transportation Plan, which is the overarching 50-year vision plan for the state. Residing within that, a good example is the Strategic Intermodal System, or SIS. Drilling down a little bit to regional areas, you have your municipal, metropolitan planning organizations, developing long-range transportation plans. They develop cost-feasible plans along with transportation improvement programs at their level. You have, in our state, county governments developing your growth management plan. Within that is a transportation comprehensive plan that happens. And certainly local governments are responsible for developing their own transit development plans, as it's called. They certainly will have their own master plans, and they might even conduct planning or corridor studies for themselves, although often FDOT is a sponsor of those or a partner with some of those. Next slide. Okay, so as project needs are identified, there's never enough money. We all know that, so we've got to prioritize. So project prioritization is the manner in which identified projects are prioritized and eventually selected for funding during the annual work program development cycle at FDOT. And as you can imagine, each level of government prioritizes its own projects on an annual basis. So in Florida, I mentioned earlier, we have metropolitan planning organizations, which are the same sort of entity or capacity as transportation planning organizations or transportation planning agencies, TPOs and TPAs. And they all are charged with, they're regulated by Federal Highway Administration, and they prioritize projects from long-range transportation plans, which they have to update every 5 years, and then they convert that into an annual transportation improvement program, or TIP, every July 1st. As well, you have your county governments and your local governments kicking in, and I already talked about the county growth management plan. FDOT itself, as you can imagine, is certainly on the ball with looking at the entire state needs, boiling down to regional and even local needs. That's what is incorporated into the various planning, approved planning documents. And so there's your SIS, your Strategic Intermodal System Plan. Another good example is Florida Rail System Plan. FDOT certainly is looking at all modes of transportation. And as well, a good example of a document for guidance is for transit development plans. FDOT doesn't, I don't believe, create its own TDP, but the local governments do. So ultimately, you have FDOT collaborating with all the other governments, stakeholders, to produce an annual and a state-approved 5-year work program. And then several months later, FDOT then receives federal approval of the 4-year State Transportation Improvement Program, or STIP. Next slide. So a little busy slide here, but essentially what you see is this graphic on a high level depicts the major components which occur within the planning phase. So on top, you have your typical steps from left to right, moving toward the PD&E phase. The blue boxes on the left represent activities or perhaps some various products that occur along the way. So as we follow each progressive step, we're moving toward individual project progression. So these early projects, as I said, are identified by MPOs and local governments. They get melded with FDOT visions and deficiency needs, and certainly the districts understand exactly what is needed with spot improvements, crash studies, things like that, aging infrastructure. So prioritizations occur as a result of all this information that's provided by these planning phase studies, whether they're a planning study, feasibility study, master plans, ACE studies. MPOs and counties also provide their specific prioritization lists to FDOT every year. ETDM planning screens are occurring during this, and they help to provide us with good early project information. And then typically after projects get programmed, we typically then run the more detailed programming screenings that give us more detailed and more refined information. While this is happening, of course, you have the SWOT process, which in the SWOT planning meeting, that is typically where we look at the candidate projects that want to be programmed, and that's where we evaluate those and help inform the districts with their selections to the tentative and then the 5-year work program. And then after the projects are selected to that work program, we then go move toward what's called a SWOT strategy meeting, where we start to refine and look a little bit deeper at each project, and we're looking for opportunities to jumpstart. What can we do to jumpstart the PD&E phase? How can we reduce its duration? Are there any tasks that we can do now that are going to really save some time later on? And there are a lot of opportunities to optimize a strategic project approach, as we say. So embedded right in this area is where ACE studies can happen. ACE studies are in fact a planning phase study, but again, to emphasize, it is embedded within the ETDM process. So finally, then you have your SWOT kickoff meeting, and that's where you have a culmination of all this information, and that gives us a really good idea of what we need to scope out when we advertise for your PD&E and design consultant acquisition. And so that's formalized at that SWOT meeting, at the SWOT kickoff meeting, I should say. Okay, next slide, please. These are some of the major project objectives that we have in a nutshell during planning phase. As you can imagine, we want to get toward purpose and need. We want to establish, often that's based on project transportation problems that we see or deficiencies, or it might be based on a new vision for a new corridor, if you will. So as you can imagine, there are traffic demand models, transportation mobility data kick in as studies and technical reports that help to give us this data. There's a whole variety of justifications that can kick in. Land use is a big one, aging infrastructure, safety considerations, crash reports, things like that. So you have technical studies coming in. Of course, an alternative corridor evaluation study is a technical study, and these technical studies can help us to further identify what some of the issues are out there. Are there, from the natural and human environment, what's out there? What project constraints are we going to face? It might be utilities, it might be an endangered species habitat. From that, we can then develop a range of alternatives, develop alternative analysis, hopefully do some eliminations. And then certainly this is done usually before we program a project. And so we want to get a reliable cost estimate and a recommended funding strategy to help the district with programming decisions. Next slide. Okay, so taking a fast look at the ETDM process, and Chris and Sylvia later are going to get into some of these milestones where you're going back and forth, but ETDM is FDOT's process to incorporate environmental considerations into transportation planning to inform that project delivery or even to inform programming. So ETDM does have two types of screening events. There's the planning screen, which is the early screening that informs us during development of long-range plans when projects are not yet programmed. And one of the intents of this is that it can be done by local governments, not just FDOT, to help inform us at that point. Later on, we conduct a more detailed programming screening after a project is programmed. This gives us more detailed and refined information. So some of the objectives of these are, for example, early identification of some of those issues. Like I said, the constraints, figuring out what's out there. A major objective is to get full and early participation of the public, of the agencies, native tribes, and then any pertinent stakeholders. This is our ability within FDOT to foster that solid link that I'm getting into planning environmental linkages now, that link planning and PD&E, and then to incorporate things always don't go smoothly. And so this is also our opportunity to have some early issue resolution mechanisms where we can get together and try to resolve things even before we get to PD&E and many times before we get to programming. So within the ETDM process, there is the environmental screening tool that does provide web-based applications, and that of course is GIS-based, and you have a website there. But again, I want to emphasize that ETDM is integrated within, I should say, ACE studies are integrated within the ETDM process, and they do occur during a screening event. Okay, move on to the next one. These symbols are some of the agencies that are members of what we call an environmental technical advisory team. Through its ETDM process and for qualifying projects for PD&E, FDOT presents these conceptualized projects and then provides an opportunity for early stakeholder input and for agency input. And this helps us to formulate credible project solutions, which can help define our PD&E project scope. Yeah, and this is based on some of the early understandings of what we're seeing out there. Certainly, this is an opportunity for intergovernmental coordination and coordination with all the ETAT teams, but it's important to note that the public can sign on to ETDM and actually subscribe to its public access site. So they will receive project notifications with an ability to view and comment on project screening. So you can bet that some of your major stakeholders out there will also chime in during that screening event. Next slide. Moving toward something that's recently had more teeth with the FAST Act in 2016. FHWA actually started the Pell Initiative in 2006. A lot of us old practitioners, here I go again saying that, we were waiting years for this, and this was a great advancement for our industry. Planning and environmental linkages is that Federal Highway Administration initiative that strengthens that expected link from planning phase into the NEPA, or the National Environmental Policy Act phase. So it's supported by brand new laws. It clearly, finally, and legally establishes that planning products from the transportation planning process are legitimate and should rightfully be incorporated into the environmental review process, or the NEPA process. Pell also provides a process by which the lead federal agency and other relevant agencies, as they use that term, can adopt or incorporate planning products and decisions into the environmental review process. It's important to note that planning products and the decisions made have to meet 10 specific conditions for later use in the PD&E phase. This is actually listed in the PD&E manual. Just one easy example is that there is a 5-year age-out limit for adoption of products. But it's also, and this is particular to ACE studies, it's vital to recognize that any alternative development or elimination decisions made during an ACE study do constitute a planning decision, and it's going to be subject to later scrutiny. So you got to make sure you're looking at some of these conditions as you're moving through. Next slide. One of the conditions of Pell requires full transparency, and so we have to make sure that the public, that we openly state that we have the intention to adopt these planning products into that environmental review process. And so within about a year ago, actually, Office of Environmental Management developed this boilerplate statement that you see. This should be on every one of your planning studies if you think you're going to have intention of using that in the PD&E process or moving toward PD&E. And finally, and a very critical note, I want to say that district practitioners should absolutely consider these Pell parameters as you're scoping your planning study itself and its components. Because if you don't have a deliberate and organized approach and don't check all the boxes, if you will, some planning products may fail to be successfully adopted or incorporated into the environmental review process, which creates a host of consequences that we don't want to see. And of course, this is where ETDM helps to check many of those boxes. But each project is individual, and you need to look at it individually. Okay, let's go to the next slide. This is my last one, yay. So when we look at ACE studies and some of these Pell conditions, fortunately, a lot of these conditions are resolved through ETDM. For example, ETDM does provide that venue to coordinate with federal and state agencies and your tribes and the public. It does conduct broad multidisciplinary evaluation of transportation needs on both the natural and the human environment. Yeah, through our methodology memorandum and the ACE report that Sylvia and Chris will cover, it does do a good job of documenting our study methodology and the results, including the public involvement that occurred. And finally, you saw that public notice language that we have. So one nice little addition that OEM put into the process is that we are concerned about that 5-year window. Boy, 5 years can go by quick after a planning study. And so the 5-year clock, if you will, doesn't start after an ACE study until publication date of the final programming screen summary report, which also includes that environmental class of action determination. So your ACER is actually part of that report. So that helps us to buy a little time down the line, if you will. So as I said, each project is individual. They're always unique. So if there's ever a question as you're starting to scope out your study, that's a great time to consult with your Office of Environmental Management.